It is now my pleasure to introduce a plenary on a topic which has bearing on whatever else we may be talking about with regards to the Arctic. And we have three remarkable speakers speaking on the Arctic from space. And in the interest of efficient use of time, I will introduce them very shortly and give the floor to them to give short presentations, and then we hopefully have some time for questions. Our first speaker is Barbara Ryan, the Secretariat Director of the United Nations Group on Earth Observations. And our second speaker is Robbie Schingler, who is the co-founder and president of Planet Labs, a remarkably innovative San Francisco-based company which is in the midst of launching a new constellation of microsatellites into space. And Andrew Solly, who is a renowned international expert on global resilience and a strategic advisor to Planet Labs. And with these introductions, I would like to give the floor to Barbara Ryan for a presentation.
Thanks, Doug. Well, thank you very much, Mr. President. Thank you, distinguished guests. It's an honor to be here. If I have any key message coming out of this presentation, it really is about unleashing the power of Earth observations. We've heard a lot this morning already about the environmental conditions here in the Arctic. And I guess what I would argue, whether it's an infrastructure issue, what we've also heard this morning, we have tremendous assets at our disposal, and yet we are not leveraging those assets. So this is about unleashing the power of Earth observations. Again, you've heard some of the comments this morning about Arctic sea ice. So you see an animation here from 1980 up to 2014. Of course, you can see seasonal or even annual variations in that, but the overall trend, certainly over that 30 or so years, is quite clear. And that has many implications that we've already talked about. When we talk about Earth observations, what do we mean? It is, in fact, any measurement that we take from the Earth. We'll talk a lot on this panel about those observations from space, and so you can see satellites, and yet there are tremendous in situ, in-place observations. So whether those in-place observations are in the atmosphere, in the ocean, or on land, or on sea or ice, our primary role is to, in fact, integrate this information so that they are in fact brought to bear on the widest suite of applications as possible. Many of these individual observations have been designed for a single discipline, and so when we talk about unleashing the power of these observations, it's taking those observations from one discipline and applying them to another discipline. This is just a sampling of some of those space-based observations. Now, these are largely operated by member states. Many of this in this room. We'll hear later on about the emerging role that the private sector is playing in Earth observations. Our goal as the Group on Earth Observations, and while we have UN member states at the table, we aren't actually a UN organization. It is an intergovernmental organization right now of 94 member states. Again, many of you in this room. If your country is not colored red on this graph or on this map, please come up and introduce yourself to me. I'd like to talk to you about that. You'll see that we've got fairly fairly good coverage here in the Arctic region and in the Northern Hemisphere. But it's not just member countries that are important. And again, with all the references about ecosystems or the creation of villages, it is also about bringing those member states together with participating organizations, as shown here, whether they are UN organizations or scientific associations, or most importantly, and we've talked about this already this morning, is the emerging role of the private sector in Earth observations. So whether they are data providers, whether they are parts of the private sector that are going to add value to this information, or is it the downstream users in agriculture and energy and transportation, again, some that you've heard from. It is essential that this community work together to leverage the information, the Earth observations that it has at its disposal for the benefit of the issues here. This just happens to be a sampling of some of our individual partners here in the Arctic, whether they are member states, represented by their member states, or some of the scientific associations. And I think one of the challenges that we have are maybe the single discipline focus of many of these organizations. So some might be interested in biodiversity issues or migratory bird issues or transportation issues. And yet, if you want to leverage the power of Earth observations, we've got to share this data across these individual disciplines. Just real quickly, a graph that talks about the results of a change in data policy, in this case by the United States. It was for the Landsat satellite. For the first Landsat satellite was launched in 1972, and for 34 or 35 years, the U.S., whether it was the private sector or whether it was the government, sold the data. As soon as they used the Group on Earth observations to advertise a change in policy, you can see the takeoff of this data. 53 scenes a day were sold at the peak of data sales, 2001. Today, since 2008, 5,700 scenes of Landsat data are downloaded daily. That's 2 orders of magnitude. And so our argument is, if your governments are building satellites or weather stations or stream gauge stations or biodiversity networks, the citizens of not only the Arctic, but of your individual countries have paid for the construct of those public infrastructures, and to sell the data is limiting the uptake of that information. And there is, in fact, economic growth in this part of the curve. We absolutely want the private sector to come in and get access to this government data to build value-added products and services. So in closing, and I'm going to need a little help starting this animation, KL, what you will see here is some data from space. It doesn't happen to be an Icelandic volcano, it's in Italy. What you will see up the side is a color change as the displacement of this volcano is changing. You will see time, 24 months, 2 years across the bottom of the graph, and you will see pressure increasing up this graph. This is observed from space. Unfortunately, we no longer have the satellite that made these observations. It was a European satellite called ENVISAT. Let's just try to run it one more time real quick, KL. Look at the scale. This is in centimeters. So from space, we are seeing centimeter scale displacement 2 years in advance of this volcano actually blowing. So as the pressure increases in this volcano, can you imagine if you had a 2-year warning for many of the volcanoes globally, but in particularly in this part of the world. So, in closing, we have heard that the Arctic region impacts the globe, a little bit different perspective, both of topography on the land and bathymetry in the water, with the North Pole in the center of this graph. This illustration is courtesy of one of our geo-partners. It's from Japan. And so again, just changing the perspective of how people view this ecosystem, and also unleashing the power of information, particularly from that information that your governments have already spent time collecting, is very important. Our plenary meeting of those 94 member countries, 77 participating organizations, and the emerging private sector will be held the 13th and 14th of November in Geneva, Switzerland. Our website is here. So please, I'd be happy to, after we answer questions, I'd be happy to talk to any of you offline. Thank you very much.
Good morning. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you, President Grimson, for inviting me here today, and Planet Labs. And also, Dr. Fenner, this is going to be an excellent 3 days. We really look forward to contributing. And if it's possible to get the slides up, sir? Yep. So my role on the panel today is going to be to discuss perhaps a new perspective, new entrants coming into the space community. And me and my background, being at NASA for about 10 years, yeah, there's slides that needs to be put up. Thank you. It's a really exciting time. There are new entrants that are coming into aerospace every single couple of weeks, it seems. And so what I want to really get a message across is that new data are coming. And tools associated with that data and information will be coming online that would allow for people to understand the state of the world as it is and make better decisions. So it is to unleash the power of Earth observations data. Great. So let me tell you this story actually through our perspective, through Planet Labs. And again, the main message is that new information sources are coming online, taking advantage of a number of pieces of technology that make this possible. But first, let me tell you about our motivation at Planet. This image is known as the Blue Marble. It was taken in 1972 in the last human mission to the moon. And this single picture of the planet perhaps made a profound impact on our understanding of us living on this fragile planet. And also in 1972 was the first year that NASA and USGS launched and operated the Landsat program. And so as Barbara mentioned, that the data that was opened up not too long ago, that is data that actually has been collected for the last 40 years. And this is a global good of data that allows researchers to understand how the planet has changed over the last 40 years. What happens when the population doubles and our cities grow and our forests shrink and the ice caps melt. But we seem to be in a place today where we do understand that change is occurring, but we do lack the actionable information necessary in order to make a better decision and do something about it. So that's our motivation at Planet. So our first mission is to make information about the changing planet visible, accessible, and actionable. And in order to do that, it starts with a new data set. So this is our satellite. It's 5 kilograms. You can pick it up. This spacecraft, albeit is extremely small, but it is highly capable and has all of the same types of systems that are necessary to work in space. And what has made this possible to miniaturize this is really the consumer electronics industry. So leveraging innovations from other sectors, understanding the space environment, then building a satellite from the ground up, all internally in our organization. And not only have we built the satellite, but we've launched them. This is actually a video taken from an astronaut. And you can see, coming up shortly, 2 of our satellites being ejected from the International Space Station. There they go. And this is quite actually amazing to see your satellites being ejected in space. You normally, last time you see it is when you bolt it to an upper stage of a launch vehicle and hope that it doesn't explode. And so not only have we launched these, but then we learn how to operate them. We learn how to process the data. And if these are so small, we can mass produce them. And if you can mass produce them, then you can come up with new mission concepts. So our mission is to image the whole world every day. And to do that, it requires a little bit more than 100 satellites in a polar orbit that effectively work together as a line scanner for the planet. So as the Earth rotates underneath it, we capture a new image of the entire Earth's surface every 24 hours. We chose to do this at a spatial resolution that's about 3 to 5 meters per pixel, which really allows for us to see global change, and put all of that data on the web with modern tools. And so that spatial resolution doesn't jeopardize personal privacy issues or national security issues, so that we can really democratize its access and increase the number of users that get information about the planet. So we've launched 71 satellites into space over the last year and a half. And I want to show you a couple of images of this to show you some of the things that we're seeing. So agriculture. That one was in Arizona. Here is a mine in Wyoming. The Suez Canal to look at global shipping. Here's a new energy infrastructure, solar farm in China, where the most recent image was about 6 months previously and it didn't exist. Here is a reservoir level, which there is a large drought that's occurring right now in Brazil, and you can actually see that change. Aquaculture in China. And glaciers. This one happens to be in Canada. And while these images are beautiful, what's really insightful about them is to actually see the change. So this animation shows an image from a year ago versus when we took a picture. Ours is on the right. And this is showing infrastructure development off the Han River in China. You can see dirt roads become paved, and you can see pylons in bridges actually become complete. The amount of change that we're seeing in urban infrastructure is really quite extraordinary. In this example, this shows we captured an image a day after a flood in Nevada. The most recent Landsat image before it was about 2 weeks earlier, so this shows a little bit of change that you can see over the course of 2 days. And what's interesting about this is you can actually see the areas where it's most likely going to flood, and so that helps you actually understand urban planning and build in infrastructure in such a way that really mitigates the potential loss of infrastructure when calamities do occur. This is an example of daily change. What captured our attention to this image was a fire. And we looked in the Landsat archive, and they happened to take a picture the day before. So this shows an example of what you can see on a daily basis. This is in Brazil, and it's modern practice to burn sugarcane before you cultivate it. And not only can you actually see that change happening every day, but you can see in the lower portion there that how many lines of sugarcane was actually cultivated in that very same day. So this is an example of getting new access to new information where you understand the state of the world as it is today and how much that has changed from the day before. So our planet is drastically, dramatically changing constantly. And with the right types of tools, then we can make better decisions. So what we're building at Planet, the data is very useful, but what we're building is really a platform for people to get access to it. And that is for companies and for governments and for nonprofit organizations and scientific organizations, because we can't think about all of the different innovations that can come out of understanding the state of the world as it is today. And so we're actually making that accessible via the web for people to build their own applications on top of it. So in summary, at Planet, our mission is to image the whole Earth every day. and make it visible so that we can actually see context in how things are on the planet, and make it accessible for people to get access to it, and then ultimately allow it to be actionable. In closing, I do want to mention something about Iceland. So President Grimson and Dagfinnur came and visited us at Planet about 6 months ago in San Francisco. And immediately, the president saw the value to this, not only to this community here, but then also in general to creating a resilient society and understanding how to make data-driven decisions. And for us, we began to understand a lot more about what Iceland has to offer. And we are, albeit a very small organization, but we are a global company. We have ground stations in New Zealand and throughout the United States, also in Germany and in the UK. And as we build out our capability of being global, Iceland offers many things. For instance, not only its location in a high latitude location for potential ground stations, but also in what they're building with respect to a green data storage and compute capability here in Iceland due to the enormous amount of power that they have developed. So as a first step, I'm happy to say that one of the Nordic's premier IT company, an Iceland company called Advanja, we're in discussions with them for hosting an archive of our data here in Iceland, and we hope that that is going to be the first step of Planet being a lot more present here. So with that, thank you very much. Really, really happy to be here, and look forward to the next 3 days of discussions. Yep.
Hello, everyone. President Grimson, distinguished delegates, it's great to be here with all of you. I'm sure your head is just buzzing with the extraordinary potential of technologies like the ones that Robbie just demonstrated. I'm Andrew Zolli. I'm a resilience researcher. I study resilience in social and ecological and systemic resilience. And I'm happy to be working very closely now with Planet Labs and with Robbie and the team on how to take the extraordinary assets that Planet Labs is producing and put them in the hands of the people who are on the very front lines of making the most important forms of social, environmental, humanitarian change in the world. Now, today, what I'd like to do just in a few minutes is just take these ideas about sensing the world around us and put them into a framework, elevate them into a framework around issues of systemic and social resilience. But before I do that, I thought we could do a little exercise together, specifically one on noticing change. And what I'd like to do, with your permission today, is I'm going to show you two images on the screen. We're going to do a little game together, okay? The two images on the screen, I promise you there's only two, and they're going to blink on the screen like this. Got that? It took me a long time to practice how to make that sound. And there's one and only one difference between the two images. And what I'd like you to do is when you see the difference between these two images, I'd like you to gently raise your hand. Not so you block the person behind you. This is not a competition. I just want to count you, okay? When you see the change, just gently raise your hand so I can count you. Everyone got that? Ready? Okay, let's go. Let's see. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. Okay, that's good. I just wanted to get about 3% of the people in the room to see it. So just out of curiosity, how many people here saw no difference between those two images? Please raise your hands. I'd like you to meet the honest cohort here at the Arctic Circle. I don't know what those other people were looking at, but never mess with a person with a clicker. For those of you who didn't see a difference between those two images, and by the way, the first time I saw this, I didn't see the difference between the two images. I'd like you to pay attention to this part of the image right here. And I'd like you to watch as the thing that holds airplanes in the sky disappeared in front of your eyeballs over and over and over again, about 40 or 50 times, and about 90% of the people in the room, 95% of the people in the room, didn't see it at all, and only about 3 to 5% of you saw it after about 25 or 30 seconds of looking. So why? Why is that the case? Why did we miss it? So how many people here started by looking at the soldiers? Raise your hands. By the way, that makes you exactly like all other human beings on Earth, so welcome to the human race. I just want you all to know, everybody looks at the soldiers first. How many people after the soldiers looked at the tail of the airplane? Or some people looked at the tail of the airplane first. Now that makes you exactly like the rest of humanity. Now, the reason we do that is because human beings are exquisitely sensitive. Our brains are designed through lots and lots of evolution and trial and error. We've developed extraordinary capacities to pay attention to the things that we think subconsciously are going to matter. And overwhelmingly, those are the things that are bound up in other people. We pay attention to what tribe people are. And we pay attention to the things that we think are going to change, the things that change every day. The things that happen in the background, the backgrounded forms of change, are much harder for human beings to pay attention to. And the reason I wanted to show you this today, in fact, you'll see in a moment, but a wonderful thinker about the future, a guy named Stuart Brand, once famously said about these kinds of changes, that in our societies, the fast-moving trends are the ones that get most of the attention, but it's actually the slow-moving trends, the stuff that's happening in the background, that's harder for us to see, that have most of the power. As you could see there. Because if you got on that airplane without an aircraft engine, that's the first thing you should check, by the way, the next time you're on a jetway. Just peek out the window and make sure they're still on the aircraft. We're living in a time in which extraordinary amounts of change are happening, but they're happening at a spatial resolution and at a temporal resolution that's difficult for human beings to comprehend. We're not designed to see change in these capacities. We're living in a time generally of spikes, of movement, of trends associated with the human footprint, from a period when things were moving broadly horizontally to broadly vertically. And this is a chart that comes from a wonderful institute called the Stockholm Resilience Center, an epicenter of research on these factors. So one of the most important things about the technologies that you're hearing about here is that they begin to take those changes that exist outside of the normal envelope of human sensing and put them into context for us. Because context is the first and most essential step to creating lasting change. The world we live in now, a world in which everything is going vertical, the number of people on Earth, the amount of water usage, ozone depletion, ocean ecosystem use, coastal zone infrastructures, the number of McDonald's restaurants has gone absolutely vertical. Terrifying to some and delighting to others, depending on your point of view. What's interesting about this is that all of these forms of verticality are connected to each other. We live in the world some have called the age of the giant hairball, giant over-connected, over-coupled systems. And when you take a world of over-coupling in which we create change in one system and we deeply connect it to changes in another system, you create complexity. And over-coupling and complexity and naturally exceeding our planetary limits leads us to an environment of inevitable surprise and creates maybe the most important question of this century. And that's this one. How, while we move hopefully ever toward a more sustainable future, do we help people and systems recover, persist, or even thrive amid disruption? Because we're going to be living with much more disruption than we have ever had before. So in order to do that, what we're beginning to see is a shift towards some new languages, some new ways of thinking about making systems, and some new ways of thinking about bolstering the natural resilient capacity of human beings. On the systems side, you're starting to see this new language of modularity and diversity, efficiency, redundancy, transparency, loose coupling so that systems can gracefully fail. If one part fails, the whole system doesn't come down. and systems that learn and adapt over time. These are the kinds of systems we're going to need to build. And one central idea about the Arctic that you've heard over and over again this morning, and I'm sure you will hear for the next few days, is that the Arctic, because it is an epicenter of change, is also a crucible, a laboratory for understanding how to build systems that work like this. On the human side, we have to think about new ways of bolstering people's trust, their cooperation, their creativity, their voice, their agency at the local level, their sense of social coherence, compassion, and solidarity with each other and with the planet. Pulling these two design agendas together is really what most of us are here to do in one way or another. But I want you to pay attention in particular to this idea of modularity, diversity, efficiency, and redundancy, because I want to tell you about one specific form of redundancy and one very resilient organization, and that is Planet Labs. And just because this just happened a couple of days ago, some of you might know that that in Virginia recently, an orbital science rocket just took off and exploded. Boom, like that. It was carrying 26 satellite doves. You are watching them. There's probably 26 streaks there. I was on an airplane when this happened, and through the gifts of great aerial Wi-Fi, I was able to instantly talk to the team, because, my goodness, this could be life-ending. What's going on? What's happened, right? I've got these news alerts coming up that something terrible has happened. And I talked to the team, and it was amazing to see that everybody was like, yeah, okay, space is hard. Space is hard. That was the message from Robbie, the CEO, Will, and the whole team. But we're keeping going. We're working on the next batch of satellites already. Because one of the ways in which building systems that are small, redundant, agile, inexpensive, where the systems they replace are big, bureaucratic, and structural, is that when you encounter inevitable failures, if you are agile and redundant, you can keep on trucking. And that's an example of the kinds of resilience that I think we're going to see more of. I'm going to end my remarks just with one little mental model for how to think about resilience at a systems level. A lot of people, this term has come up a great deal. There are extraordinary organizations, most recently the Rockefeller Foundation, USAID, the Swedish government, soon to be the World Bank, I think, and others have come together to form a new global resilience partnership that's looking at vulnerable places in the world and how to bolster their systemic and social resilience. You hear this term bandied around a lot, and in fact, Planet Labs I think will be a significant collaborator in those efforts. But then the question that comes up, how do you put them into practice? What are the verbs? What does it mean to do this stuff? And so I thought I'd just share with you one mental model that's been helpful for bringing people together over these conversations. It breaks the idea of resilience into 4 basic clusters of activities. And the first one is about building regenerative capacity, the kinds of slow building of health. In a society, it's often measured by creativity and trust and social coherence. In a food system, it's measured by the capacity of the system to provide for the people who depend upon it. This happens to be a measure of the photosynthetic capacity of, in this case, North America, as recently measured from space. And this is a slow form of capacity building. Capacity building doesn't happen instantaneously. It's the slow process of making a system healthy and keeping it healthy. Then there's a second cluster of activities, and those are about sensing emerging risks. Essentially, how do we instrument a system to listen for change? Now, not every form of change can be anticipated, but the very act of listening itself is its own form of capacity building, and that is why, especially, these kinds of technologies are so important, because they allow us to listen in such a fundamentally new way. The third capacity is about how we respond to disruptions when they occur. And one of the most powerful things about this kind of data is what happens not just before a disruption occurs, but how we can put it into the hands of people who are directly affected, not just governments and institutions and companies, but also citizens. because citizens represent a tremendous form of capacity in their own right in response. And then finally, there's the long process of learning and transforming, deciding when a system has shown itself to be vulnerable, when do we decide to bolster its capacity, and when do we decide to abandon it and transform our dependence upon it because we can no longer rely on it. That's ultimately a political question. But here's the important thing. When you look at these 4 different clusters of activities that are all connected with feedback loops and feedbackward loops, some of them slow, some of them quick, all of this data, all of this information is going to inform each of these activities. It's not just about responding more quickly, it's about anticipating what comes next and learning how to think differently about the kinds of futures. We can only do that if we have the right kinds of information to begin to think about. And that is incredibly exciting. And that's why these efforts in particular, I think, are going to lead us to a much more resilient future. Thank you very much.
Okay, let's try to entertain 1 or 2 questions from the audience, although we do not have much time, so. Okay.
I guess this is mostly for Robbie. 3 quick questions. Do you plan on putting anything on your spacecraft that's other than visible imaging? Do you plan on cooperating with any of the other companies that are in this business, like Skybox and Digital Globe? And I'm curious what your revenue model is, either now or what you plan on it to be.
Sure, those are all 3 great questions. We are operating on silicon right now, which means we can get into the near infrared. Our first mission, though, is to map it in RGB. And that is, again, for global change, because there's a lot of information in those pixels that we can then feed those into new models and new tools for organizations. 2 is collaboration, absolutely. We see ourselves as being very complementary to existing commercial remote sensing systems that are out there today. You mentioned Digital Globe and Skybox. Both of those are higher resolution satellites that take a picture of one location for one particular customer. So that's a point and shoot model. We've borrowed something mainly from the scientific community, which is more of a mapping and a monitoring mission, where we image everywhere very frequently. And so those are 2 highly complementary data sets that actually reinforce one another. 3 is around revenue model. So today, the commercial remote sensing business is primarily focused on selling pixels. And so we do license pixels to customers. But one of the beautiful things about having a global monitoring mission is that you can do price discrimination based on use case and or geography. So if you are a smallholder farmer in Africa, the amount of imagery that you can consume for free is a lot, versus if you are a for-profit agriculture company in Western Europe. There would be a different price point for them. So the short answer is our platform is a freemium model to get access to these data and then the tools associated with it. Then as we get larger, deeper stacks of data where then people can subscribe to value-added information feeds, that's then the majority of where the revenue will be coming from, and then the dollars per pixel actually go down.
Okay, great. 1 other question, and then I am afraid we are out of time.
Thanks very much for tremendously interesting presentations. I think we're very much used to looking at the use of this technology from sort of a top-down model for government security concerns, industry, that sort of thing. I'm wondering how you see better access to this technology working more from the bottom up. So how can communities really utilize this? Small communities, say, in the Arctic, and maybe how does that influence resiliency of small communities in the Arctic? What can this bring in terms of a model of resiliency moving forward?
I'll just take one quick stab at a couple of thoughts there. So first of all, the most important thing to know is that simply turning on a data pipe will not make a community more resilient. And it's principally because one of the central gaps is about technical competency, capacity, self-confidence, the ability to understand and use this information to turn it from data into wisdom. And the good news is there's a proliferation of new organizations that are working to build that capacity at the community level. One of the things I showed, for instance, was it was just referenced very briefly in that talk, was a mobile application that was developed by an organization called Ushahidi. It was actually developed by a group of bloggers in Kenya who developed a crowdsourced mobile mapping platform that allowed ordinary citizens in places where there wasn't very good information to pull information together to see what was happening around them, around voting or around outbreaks of violence and other sorts of things. And those sorts of innovations came directly from the community. So, and they are spreading in a peer-to-peer, village-to-village way. And that is one of the most exciting aspects of this whole enterprise. Because classic disruptive innovation is taking things that were previously the provenance of the very few at very expensive and making them available to the very many at relatively inexpensive rates. And so one of the things I can say about Planet Labs, just not to shill for Planet Labs, but there are many other wonderful organizations that do similar things, but Planet Labs' mission from the beginning has been how do we ensure that the data actually gets into those hands. So there's a governance structure, there's a .org, planet.org, which is going to work with key stakeholders, communities, municipalities, social enterprises and social entrepreneurs to ensure the uptake is seeded at the bottom so it can grow up.
Barbara, I would like to comment.
I'd like to add just one thing and actually reinforce something that Andrew said, and that was we didn't talk at all about crowdsourcing today. But if we go back to one of those first graphs about Earth observations, you need ground-based observations as well, surface-based, ground-based, what we call in situ observations. So it's the combination of those ground-based observations and the satellite observations. Because no matter how wonderful it is observing the Earth from space for broad geographic coverage, it's still just looking at light reflectance. You've got to be able to assign some value to that, some actual parameter to that. And so whether it's citizens collecting that data, whether it's our stream gauging networks and our mapping agencies or our meteorological agencies, we've got to combine that information. And then just lastly, many citizens don't even know this information exists. And so that's our advocacy for broad, open data policy so they can first understand that the information exists no matter where they live.
I just add one last thing. Unfortunately, it often takes a disruption for communities to actually go out and find out how many assets exist. And what is really powerful is what happens when, and this is what the future is going to look like. It's going to look like a stack of data in which you have crowdsourced mobile information, governmental and meteorological information, real-time or close to real-time space-based information, machine learning algorithms, that is to say artificial intelligence doing some of the jobs, and citizens all working together in a soup. And that sort of framework of putting together the right kinds of lenses that are needed for a community to get really focused on what's happening in their community, that's coming. And I would say it's easily as disruptive as the mobile phone itself was. Easily.
Okay, great. Sadly, we are out of time. And with this, we need to conclude the morning sessions. And lunch is served in the Harpa Corner, which is, if you leave the auditorium and take a left turn, then you will find Harpa Corner, where you will find lunch. And thank you to the panelists for great presentations on a very exciting topic. And I hope we can continue this discussion in the afternoon. Thank you.